Morning, everyone. Welcome to Center Church. We're going to be continuing our series through the life of David this morning. This is week 3, and today we're looking at that grand old story, the story of David and Goliath. So I wonder if you mind turning with me to 1 Samuel chapter 17, and we're going to be reading together from verse 41. So 1 Samuel 17 from verse 41. Meanwhile, the Philistine, speaking about Goliath, with his shield bearer in front of him, kept coming closer to David. He looked David over and saw that he was little more than a boy, glowing with health and handsome, and he despised him. He said to David, "Am I a dog that you come at me with sticks?" And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. "Come here," he said, "and I'll give your flesh to the birds and the wild animals." David said to the Philistine, "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I'll strike you down and cut off your head." It's like, this is a young guy talking here, right? Just woohoo. "This very day I will give you the carcasses of the Philistine army. I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds and the wild animals, and the whole world will know there is a God in Israel. All these gathered here will know it is not by sword or by spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands." As the Philistine moved closer to attack him, David ran quickly to the battle line to meet him. Reaching into his bag and taking out a stone, he slung it and struck the Philistine on the forehead. The stone sunk into his forehead and he fell face down on the ground. So David triumphed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone. Without a sword in his hand, he struck down the Philistine and killed him. David ran and stood over him. He took hold of the Philistine's sword, drew it from the sheath. After he killed him, he cut off his head with a sword. It's like a super exciting story. And what I'd like to look at this morning is how the different characters in the story interplay with one another, and how their attitudes and the way they are feeling and what they are experiencing in the moment contributes to how they contribute to the overall story. I'll explain what I mean. But firstly, maybe just by way of introduction, I'd like to tell you a little story. So one of the things I love doing, I love fishing. I'm not very good at fishing. In fact, I think that my role is to make it awesome for everyone else who goes fishing with me, because when I go fishing, everyone else seems to catch and I catch nothing. But anyway, I still love it, and I'm like fully into fishing. And one of the places I love to go fishing is a place in South Africa called the Wild Coast. And the reason it's called the Wild Coast is because the sea's quite deep. The edge of the continent drops off quite quickly there. It's quite close to the land, and so the sea is very unpredictable. So what happens is you'll be standing fishing on the rocks, and the sea is flat as a dam. And next minute, out of nowhere, these massive waves will come. And people have lost their lives on the Wild Coast, been washed out to sea. It's an incredibly dangerous place. And last year, we were down at the Wild Coast fishing with some friends, and there was a guy, Robbie, who came down with us, and he was fishing for the first time on the Wild Coast. He'd never experienced it before. And we'd said to Robbie, remember 2 things when you fish on the Wild Coast. Number 1, when you don't take your eye off the sea. Don't ever take your eye off the sea, and don't turn your back on the sea. It's really, really important. And if a big wave does come, what you do is don't try and run. If you know, it's the worst thing you can do. If a big wave comes, you hunker down and you lean into the wave and you just let it hit you if you can't get out of the way. And so what happened was, we were fishing the one morning, and the waves were perfect, and the fish were like all over the place, like they never are, but they were. I was even catching fish. That's how good it was. And Robbie was catching, and out of nowhere this massive wave came. Robbie saw the wave and he turned and tried to run, and this wave hits him from behind, and he just disappeared from our view completely. Fortunately, the wave hit him and slid him over the rocks and hit him into a rock pool, so he didn't get washed back into the ocean. But as the water ran out, we all ran up to see and try and find where he was. And as he stood up, his legs in front looked like he'd been gone over a cheese grater. There were gouges out of the front of his legs, and his boots just filled up with blood. And we looked at Robbie, and it was like the worst thing we could see, because he turned and tried to run from the wave that had hit him. And I'd like to talk a little bit about our positioning this morning, because how we position ourselves in times of opposition, from the story specifically. And there are 3 positions that people take in the story that I think can apply to us, and we can kind of ask ourselves, which position am I taking? And in response to the position that I'm taking, I can kind of see what the outcome's going to be. Hopefully it challenges us a little bit and stirs us on a little bit towards going for it and making the most of this time. And so our first group of people we're going to be looking at this morning is Saul and his army. So 1 Samuel chapter 17, it says, as he was talking with him, this is verse 23, so it was a little bit earlier than the text we read. It says, as he was talking with him, Goliath, the Philistine, champion from Gath, stepped out from his lines, and he shouted his usual defiance, and David heard it. Whenever the Israelites saw the man, they all fled from him in great fear. And so the Israelites' position here, and along with Saul, was to flee from him in great fear. And I'd like to say this, that when we are facing a situation, and when the Israelites were facing Goliath, the fight didn't start when someone went sword to sword with Goliath. No one went sword to sword with Goliath. Goliath had already won the fight against all of these guys because they had begun to believe what he was saying. They were so immersed in what he's saying. They were so hearing what he was saying, impressed by his size and his prowess. And, this guy had a sword, a spear, and a javelin. This guy was like kitted completely. He had every weapon you could think of. He was like a mobile tank. And so they saw that, and they'd already lost the battle before they'd even gone on. And I think it's important to understand that oftentimes we can lose the battle before we've even started, because we've already given into terror without even crossing swords with the thing that we faced. In verse 10, it says this, when the Philistine was talking, when Goliath was talking, it says, the Philistine said, this day I defy the armies of Israel. Give me a man, let us fight each other. On hearing the Philistine's words, Saul and all the Israelites were dismayed and terrified. Now, I'm not scared of much in my life. Maybe I'm a bit old and a bit stupid now. But I do have one particular phobia, and we recently had a men's or dads and kids night away, and the things that I'm completely phobic were all over the place there, and that's geese. When I was a kid, I was chased by one of these white geese, and it probably wasn't as big as I remember it, but this thing was the size of a house. I remember its beak was bright orange, and it had big fangs. This is how my brain recollects this, and it came thundering out of the lake, and it pecked me on my butt as I ran away with my little stubby legs. And to this day, I'm absolutely goose phobic. And so we go to this dads and kids night away, and I'm supposed to be all brave with my daughters, taking them camping, and there's just geese everywhere. And so I'm walking around, and my daughters are protecting me as we go for a walk to the loo at night. That's one incident, right? I had one incident, but fortunately I could come home. But what this story it tells us, but we don't think about, was Goliath came out and he challenged the Israelite army every single day for 40 days. Now, if you think about what we're facing at the moment with our lockdowns, 21 days. Now, we are just over a week into this. Can you imagine 40 days? So we're about 10 days in. So imagine 4 times this length of facing this thing day in and day out, this challenge that Goliath comes out and he faces the people. Now, I guess in the beginning, maybe day 1, he didn't seem so bad. The giant's huge, but everyone's hoping that someone else is going to take him. Everyone knows their town hero, the guy who could do sword fighting really well he'll probably take them out. He's the guy, And day 2, no one comes forward. Day 3, maybe there's a story we hear that old Benny down in battalion number 41 has been talking about taking on Goliath. Yeah, Benny's got this. He's going to take them. Day 4, Benny's nowhere to be found. Right? Benny heard that everyone wanted to take Goliath on. Benny's gone on an extended holiday. By day 10, the guys are beginning to talk that the generals have been talking amongst themselves, and even they're terrified. Their leaders are terrified. Day 20, people hear that it's so bad. The king's offered his daughter's hand in marriage to the guy who takes Goliath on. By day 40, the guys are just like, people are hiding under their beds. They're terrified. And the point is this, friends, that giants have a habit of growing very quickly over time. The problem, or the thing that we're facing, if we don't deal with it immediately, grows very quickly over time. The thing that we're afraid of, if we don't do something about it up front and quickly, the problem begins to get bigger and bigger in our minds. And that's what happened for the Israelites. This thing had got bigger and bigger. Over 40 days, this giant had got absolutely massive in their mind. And so what happened now is fear is running like a virus through the Israelite camp. And it's just everywhere. No one can look one another in the eye because everyone's ashamed that no one's fighting the giant. Everyone knows someone should stand up, but no one's standing up. There's no heroes in the camp. Everybody's whipped. And they're kind of finding this mutual comfort in fear. In 1995, one of my favorite bands, Soul Asylum, sung the song Misery. And the opening line says, "They say misery loves company." And that might as well have been the theme song for Saul's army at this time, because everyone's miserable, everyone's running away. The position of their army was back-footed and afraid. And that leads us to our second point, which is David coming from his dad. In 1 Samuel 17, from verse 17, it says, "Now Jesse," David's dad, "said to David, 'Take this ephah of roasted grain,'" which is about 16 kgs, "'these 10 loaves of bread for your brothers, and hurry to their camp. Take along these 10 cheeses to the commander of their unit. See how your brothers are, and bring some assurance from them. They are with Saul and all the men of Israel in the valley of Elah, fighting against the Philistines," or hiding under their beds, hiding from the Philistines, but whatever. So what is David's role in this story? David's not going there to fight. He's not going as part of the army. He's at home with his dad looking after the sheep. He's been sent home. And so David's role is to be the food delivery guy. He's basically like Uber Eats right now. His job is to bring the food, drop it off, and then go back to his dad and say, "Everything's cool. I gave the cheese to the commander. I gave the grain and the bread to the brothers, and everything is absolutely fine." That's his job. No one in the story, not the king, not the army, not his brothers, least of all his brothers, expected David to have to take on the giant. And here's the thing, when we're talking about the second position is, if we are passive and we only ever do what we've been asked to do, right? In my mind or my understanding, we've actually done nothing. I am my brother's keeper. That is the truth. And I'm the instrument of God himself on the earth. And it's so easy for us to go, well, that's not my job. It's not mine to do. Someone else can do that. No one asked me to do it, so I haven't done it. And David could have 100% been in that position. In fact, his dad wanted him to go home. He could have been like, "Oh, guys, love to help with the giant. Unfortunately, though, dad needs me to get back to him. And he's getting old, and just want to encourage him." He had all the excuses in the world. But David doesn't see himself like that. He sees himself as God's instrument on the planet. And one of the things I absolutely love about this season that we're in at the moment is we've seen guys getting so activated in the church, not being so focused on themselves. So on Thursday, Taz, one of the guys in the church, he's a guitar player in the band, but he's also a great cook. Taz did a 40-minute Facebook Live where he taught us how to make flatbread and hummus, like homemade hummus, like we made our own hummus, which is amazing. And Geraldine, who's a fitness model, she's been doing fitness training on Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays, some basic exercises for us, also on Facebook Live. Now, that's not necessarily because anyone said you must, and anyone's putting pressure on them to have to do that. No, they're going, well, this is my thing. I can bring it to the table. And friends, I think sometimes we can think, well, I'm not running away. This isn't my fight. This isn't mine to get involved in. But I think an attitude where we say it's not my job or not my problem is just as unhelpful as running away. Neglect is as unhelpful as fear. Neglect can be as unhelpful as fear. And that's the second position we can find ourselves in. We're not running away. It's not a position of running away, but it's a position of uninvolved and being passive. And David didn't do that. This brings us to our third and final point, or third and final person. So we had David coming from his dad, but the third point is David on the battlefield. And I'd like to make 3 quick observations about David on the battlefield and how his position allowed him to be able to overcome. The first thing is this: David had the advantage of the complete lack of perspective, which sounds weird because nowadays I think we very much want to have all the perspective. I want to know what's going on. I want to know all the ins and outs. I want as much information as possible. In fact, we live in a day and age where we have access to all kinds of information. The internet is a giant repository of everything. There's so much stuff that we can go and learn. And so we have access to all this information and we are used to having all the facts. But what made David so strong and what allowed him to have this position of being able to overcome was the fact that he didn't have perspective in the situation at all, right? Remember we said that giants grow over time and that there was this prevailing fear that was running through the camp where Saul and his armies were, and everyone's terrified. David wasn't there during that time. For 40 days, this had been going on, but David wasn't there. He was back with his dad. So he wasn't part of that negative conversation that was just going round and round and round. He's back at home. It had no impact on him. And what's interesting, I think, if you had to talk about the story from 2 different perspectives, we look at the story and we call it David and Goliath, or the day David kicked Goliath's ass and killed him. But if you had to write the story from Saul's perspective, the story would probably be called 40 Days of Fear. and it would be something like a horror movie. And so can I encourage us, and here's a little bit of the things maybe that start to stir us up and stir us to action. The first thing is this: just like David, he had the advantage of the lack of perspective. Can I ask us that over the next little while that we need to learn, and as a community, if we're going to stand and we're going to be leaning forward in our position, right? Not being passive or leaning backwards, leaning forward in our position, we're going to need to learn to filter the turd, if I can put it like that. And I'm being a bit crass by it, but I just think it's really helpful. We need to filter the turd. Some of us, guys, honestly, we need to get off our social media. We need to learn to block some people on our Twitter feeds and unfriend some people on Facebook, because there's all the stuff that's washing over us. These aren't the times, and if I can encourage us, these aren't the times where you're just going to sit on Facebook or sit on YouTube and just follow the YouTube rabbit trail. I don't know if you've ever done that. You sat down watching a wildlife movie, and next thing it's 2 a.m. and you're watching movies about, I don't know, about aliens and stuff like that. And you're like, how did I get here? These aren't times to do that. It's time to be deliberate, to filter what's coming into our minds, filter it out so that we don't give in to the prevailing culture that's going on around us, that we're able to stand and with a fresh perspective on things, be able to say, this is what I stand for, this is what God is saying, and this is what's true. I had a young guy phone me this week, and he was absolutely terrified. He'd been watching a bunch of stuff online, and he's like, John, is it the end of the world and the mark of the beast and the Antichrist and all this kind of stuff? And I was like, bro, all we can do at the moment is trust Jesus and deal with what's right in front of us. The end of days will come at some stage in the future, and Jesus will look out for us then as well. But for now, sitting worrying about what ifs and when we's and maybes is incredibly unhelpful. I'm not saying we shouldn't plan for the future. I think we should be wise about the future. But to give into this fear and this prevailing sense of panic, perhaps, that some people have given into is incredibly unhelpful at the moment. So David had the advantage of the lack of perspective. And I think for some of us, we need a little bit more of a lack of perspective, if you like. The second thing was this, that under David being on the battlefield, the thing that gave him that ability to lean forward was that David had won the little battles. Now, maybe not a little battle to us, but in compared to Goliath, these were little battles. David had killed a lion and he'd killed a bear. Now listen, if it was me, if I'd killed a lion, I would be like, that's me done. I've done my big heroic thing for my life. I'm going to retire now, and I'll be able to tell everyone the stories. I'll write a book about the day I killed the lion. David killed the lion and he killed the bear. And then he was prepared to take on Goliath. And so he was well practiced in the little battles, which gave him strength to win in the big battle. I was watching a YouTube channel while prepping for the sermon about how slings work. And I'll provide a link in the description to the video I watched if you guys want to watch it. Really, really helpful. But what this guy said, the YouTube channel is called Black Scout Survival, and he was learning how to use a sling that like David used to use, a hunting sling. And so he put in hours of practice every day to learn how to use this sling. And he said after a year, he was at the level or the proficiency of a small child in an indigenous people group that would have used this sling. So after a year, he was at the same level as like a child in one of those groups. And the thing is, our gifts and our strengths, we need to exercise them in the small moments. I think sometimes we can feel like it's not important. My gift is so small. But this story teaches us that small stones can take out big giants. Little stones can take out huge enemies. And so what's really important, I think, in this season is that we learn to exercise our gifts. We find out what our gifts are, and we're faithful with them in the little. So how I lead myself is going to feed into how I lead my family, is going to feed into how I lead in my workplace. How I see myself, right? The scripture says, love others as you love yourself. And so if my self-image is broken before God and I haven't got healed here, I'm going to treat other people badly, hurt people. And so what happens is I begin to work on the little things, win the little battles, so when the time comes for the big battle, I know how to win. In Romans chapter 12 from verse 3, Paul writes, "For by grace given me, I say to every one of you, do not think of yourself more highly than you ought, but rather think of yourself with sober judgment, in accordance with the faith that God has distributed to each of you. For just as each of us has one body with many members, and these members do not all have the same function, so in Christ, though many, we form one body, and each member belongs to all the others. We have different gifts according to the grace given to each of us. If your gift is prophesying, then prophesy in accordance with your faith. If it's serving, then serve. If it's teaching, then teach. If it's to encourage, then give encouragement. If it's giving, then give generously. And if it is to lead, do it diligently. If it's to show mercy, do it cheerfully. And can I say this? I think this text kind of spells it out and says it all to us. Can I encourage us? One of the ways that we can learn to start to lean forward positionally in a season like this is to exercise our gift. If you're an encourager, can I encourage you? And I know I'm throwing the bar up high, and I'm not trying to make it legalistic for us. But write something down. You've got some time. 2 people a day. Just send something encouraging to 2 people a day. Spread your 1 to 2. And then it's amazing how you, one person, feed it to 2. And then those 2 people feed it on and feed it on. And eventually the thing becomes a wave. Take your gift and give it to others. If your gift is prophecy, then send prophetic words to people. And not prophetic words like it's the end of days and the devil's going to eat you and weird stuff like that and directional stuff. I see God sending you to Timbuktu. I'm talking about encouraging people. This is what God has for you. I can see the gift, hear from God, because prophecy is given specifically to encourage and to build up the body. You know, if it's to be generous, find avenues to be generous with. We're going to have an opportunity over the next, this week, I'm going to be talking to us a little bit, that we can get behind Cherished, which is an outreach program, which is based at Center Church, run by a couple in the church. And we're going to have an opportunity to get involved there. And so I'd love you to be part of that thing as well. When opportunities pop up, we're looking for opportunities, right? David wasn't sitting back, like we said, on the back foot going, it's not my job. He was looking for an opportunity and then saying, I can see the gap. And based on the gap, this is my gift. I can speak into that gap and I can bring my thing to the table. And then the last thing is, so David, 1, he'd had the advantage of the lack of perspective. Number 2, he'd won the little battles. And the third thing was this: David knew his God. And I feel like I'm ringing this bell every devotion. I'm preaching this every time we preach, but it's so important. David was both a worshiper and a warrior. David was a shepherd and a sheep. He shepherded sheep, and then he became king of Israel, and he shepherded God's people. But he was always a sheep before God, and he allowed God to shepherd him. And in 1 Samuel 17, David says this: the Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine. David was good with that sling of his. He was really good with that sling of his. But he knew that it would be God. God would be the one who would rescue him. And here's the thing. No one asked David to take on Goliath. But he knew before God that he had a responsibility. And friends, it's so easy for us to live in the audience of people and hear and live by their expectations instead of saying before God, what is he expecting of me? And secondly, around that thing of David knowing his God, is David wasn't dissuaded by the lack of faith that other people had in him, because he knew that God believed in him, because God had made him and God had created him for such a time as this. And so can I encourage us over this time to be worshipers, to spend time with God, to take time out to be with him and to hear from him, to allow God to speak to us, to get to know God in our times of prayer, in reading the word. Lord, I want to know you. I don't just want to get through my Bible. One of the things I'd love to do with us, and I'd really like to, and I'll let us know from tomorrow, I'll probably try it for the week, is I'd like to send us the texts ahead of time of what we're going to be looking at in our devotion so that you're able to read it, maybe a little bit ahead of the devotion. And maybe in the evening just before, so that we're able to look at that text together as a group, that we can grow together in understanding on how to interpret Scripture and how to look at Scripture so that it means something to us. This is the thing, and I love how this ends, talking about David's position. What was David's position? It's 1 Samuel 17 from verse 48, we read it. As the Philistine moved closer to attack him, David ran quickly towards the battle line to meet him. David's position was leaning forward, like, I'm coming for you. You think you're coming for me. I'm coming for you, man. And so to wrap things up today, I love this text that Paul writes in Philippians chapter 3 from verse 12. He says, not that I've already attained all of this, or I've already arrived at my goal, but I press on to take hold of that for which Christ took hold of me. Brothers and sisters, I do not consider myself yet to have taken hold of it, but one thing I do, forgetting what is behind and straining on towards ahead, I press on towards the goal to win the prize for which God has called me heavenward in Christ Jesus. So hopefully this has stirred us up a little bit. Hopefully this has stirred us that we don't want to be back-footed and given to the fear and the environment around us. Also, we don't want to be passive and just waiting for people to say or ask us to do something. We want to be leaning forward into what God has for us. want to finish with this. If you've never had an opportunity to give your life to Jesus and to surrender to Him, you don't know what it means to be a Christian. Maybe you think being a Christian means going to church. It doesn't. To be a Christian means that I have a personal relationship with God. It's that final point that David knew as God, that you can get to know your God. Perhaps you've drifted and you need someone to pray with you, and you feel like it's time, you need to come home, you need to be in relationship with God, and He's been knocking on the door of your heart. If that's you, can I encourage you this? Why not send an email to cindy@centerchurch.co.za. It's on the screen. And we'd love to chat to you. We can hook up with you on a WhatsApp video call, no matter where you are in the world. We can contact you on a Zoom phone call if you'd like. But we'd love to be able to talk this through with you, because the most important thing we have at the moment is we want to be a people who know their God, so that we're able to lean forward into the season that's ahead.
Thank you so much for joining us. You might be asking yourself the question, how can I take this further? Firstly, you can send us your contact details to cindy@centerchurch.co.za, where we can include you in our online connect groups and you can receive our daily devotional. Secondly, you can hop on our website where you can access previous sermons and find out more about who we are at Center Church. Thirdly, if you consider yourself as part of Center Church, we want to thank you so much for your ongoing financial partnership. The banking details are on the website. Thank you so much for joining us and hope you have an amazing Sunday.